Schomberg, at all events, needn't, since from first to last, I am happy to say, there was not the slightest fracas. Overcoming a nervous contraction of the windpipe, I had managed to exclaim, "Captain Falk!" His start of surprise was perfectly genuine, but afterwards he neither smiled nor scowled. He simply waited. Then, when I had said, "I must have a talk with you," and had pointed to a chair at my table, he moved up to me, though he didn't sit down. Schomberg, however, with a long tumbler in his hand, was making towards us prudently, and I discovered then the only sign of weakness in Falk. He had for Schomberg a repulsion resembling that sort of physical fear some people experience at the sight of a toad. Perhaps to a man so essentially and silently concentrated upon himself, though he could talk well enough, as I was to find out presently, the other's irrepressible loquacity, embracing every human being within range of the tongue, might have appeared unnatural, disgusting, and monstrous. He suddenly gave signs of restiveness, positively like a horse about to rear, and muttering hurriedly as if in great pain, "No, I can't stand that fellow," seemed ready to bolt. This weakness of his gave me the advantage at the very start. "Veranda," I suggested, as if rendering him a service, and walked him out by the arm. We stumbled over a few chairs. We had the feeling of open space before us, and felt the fresh breath of the river. Fresh, but tainted. The Chinese theaters across the water made in the sparsely twinkling mass of gloom an Eastern town presents at night, blazing centers of light, and of a distant and howling uproar. I felt him become suddenly tractable again, like an animal, like a good-tempered horse when the object that scares him is removed. Yes, I felt in the darkness there how tractable he was, without my conviction of his inflexibility, tenacity rather, perhaps, being in the least weakened. His very arm, abandoning itself to my grasp, was as hard as marble, like a limb of iron, but I heard a tumultuous scuffling of boot soles within. The unspeakable idiots inside were crowding to the windows, climbing over each other's backs behind the blinds, billiard cues and all. Somebody broke a window pane, and with the sound of falling glass, so suggestive of riot and devastation, Schomberg reeled out after us in a state of funk which had prevented him from parting with his brandy and soda. He must have trembled like an aspen leaf. The piece of ice in the long tumbler he held in his hand tinkled with an effect of chattering teeth. "I beg you, gentlemen," he expostulated thickly. "Come, really now, I must insist." How proud I am of my presence of mind. "Hallo," I said instantly in a loud and naive tone. "Somebody's breaking your windows, Schomberg. Would you please tell one of your boys to bring out here a pack of cards and a couple of lights, and 2 drinks, will you?" To receive an order soothed him at once. It was business. "Certainly," he said in an immensely relieved tone. The night was rainy, with wandering gusts of wind, and while we waited for the candles, Falk said, as if to justify his panic, "I don't interfere in anybody's business. I don't give any occasion for talk. I am a respectable man. But this fellow is always making out something wrong, and can never rest till he gets somebody to believe him." This was the first of my knowledge of Falk. This desire of respectability, of being like everybody else, was the only recognition he vouchsafed to the organization of mankind. For the rest, he might have been the member of a herd, not a society. Self-preservation was his only concern, not selfishness, but mere self-preservation. Selfishness presupposes consciousness, choice, the presence of other men. But his instinct acted as though he were the last of mankind, nursing that law, like the only spark of a sacred fire. I don't mean to say that living naked in a cavern would have satisfied him. Obviously, he was the creature of the conditions to which he was born. No doubt self-preservation meant also the preservation of these conditions. But essentially it meant something much more simple, natural, and powerful. How shall I express it? It meant the preservation of the 5 senses of his body, let us say, taking it in its narrowest as well as in its widest meaning. I think you will admit before long the justice of this judgment. However, as we stood there together on the dark veranda, I had judged nothing as yet, and I had no desire to judge, which is an idle practice anyhow. The light was long in coming. "Of course," I said in a tone of mutual understanding, "it isn't exactly a game of cards I want with you." I saw him draw his hands down his face, the vague stir of the passionate and meaningless gesture, but he waited in silent patience. It was only when the lights had been brought out that he opened his lips. I understood his mumble to mean that he didn't know any card games. "Like this, Schomberg and all the other fools will have to keep off," I said, tearing open the pack. "Have you heard that we are universally supposed to be quarreling about a girl? You know who, of course. I am really ashamed to ask, but is it possible that you do me the honor to think me dangerous?" As I said these words, I felt how absurd it was, and also I felt flattered, for really, what else could it be? His answer, spoken in his usual dispassionate undertone, made it clear that it was so, but not precisely as flattering as I supposed. He thought me dangerous with Hermann more than with the girl herself. But as to quarreling, I saw at once how inappropriate the word was. We had no quarrel. Natural forces are not quarrelsome. You can't quarrel with the wind that inconveniences and humiliates you by blowing off your hat in a street full of people. He had no quarrel with me. Neither would a boulder falling on my head have had. He fell upon me in accordance with the law by which he was moved, not of gravitation, like a detached stone, but of self-preservation. Of course, this is giving it a rather wide interpretation. Strictly speaking, he had existed and could have existed without being married. Yet he told me that he had found it more and more difficult to live alone. Yes, he told me this, in his low, careless voice. To such a pitch of confidence had we arrived at the end of half an hour. It took me just about that time to convince him that I had never dreamed of marrying Hermann's niece. Could any necessity have been more extravagant? And the difficulty was the greater because he was so hard hit himself that he couldn't imagine anybody else being able to remain in a state of indifference. Any man with eyes in his head, he seemed to think, could not help coveting so much bodily magnificence. This profound belief was conveyed by the manner he listened, sitting sideways to the table and playing absently with a few cards I had dealt to him at random. And the more I saw into him, the more I saw of him. The wind swayed the lights so that his sunburnt face, whiskered to the eyes, seemed to successively flicker crimson at me and to go out. I saw the extraordinary breadth of the high cheekbones, the perpendicular style of the features, the massive forehead, steep like a cliff, denuded at the top, largely uncovered at the temples. The fact is, I had never before seen him without his hat. But now, as if my fervor had made him hot, he had taken it off and laid it gently on the floor. Something peculiar in the shape and setting of his yellow eyes gave them the provoking, silent intensity which characterized his glance. But the face was thin, furrowed, worn. I discovered this through the bush of his hair, as you may detect the gnarled shape of a tree trunk in a dense undergrowth. These overgrown cheeks were sunken. It was an anchorite's bony head, fitted with a Capuchin's beard, and adjusted to a Herculean body. I don't mean athletic. Hercules, I take it, was not an athlete. He was a strong man, susceptible to female charms, and not afraid of dirt. And thus with Falk, who was a strong man. He was extremely strong, just as the girl, since I must think of them together, was magnificently attractive by the masterful power of flesh and blood, expressed in shape, in size, in attitude, that is, by a straight appeal to the senses. His mind, meantime, preoccupied with respectability, quailed before Schomberg's tongue, and seemed absolutely impervious to my protestations. And I went so far as to protest that I would just as soon think of marrying my mother's, dear old lady, faithful female cook, as Hermann's niece. Sooner, I protested in my desperation, much sooner. But it did not appear that he saw anything outrageous in the proposition, and in his skeptical immobility he seemed to nurse the argument that at all events the cook was very, very far away. It must be said that just before I had gone wrong by appealing to the evidence of my manner whenever I called on board the Diana. I had never attempted to approach the girl or to speak to her, or even to look at her in any marked way. Nothing could be clearer. But as his own idea of, let us say, courting seemed to consist precisely in sitting silently for hours in the vicinity of the beloved object, that line of argument inspired him with distrust. Staring down his extended legs, he let out a grunt, as much as to say, "That's all very fine, but you can't throw dust in my eyes." At last I was exasperated into saying, "Why don't you put the matter at rest by talking to Hermann?" And I added sneeringly, "You don't expect me perhaps to speak for you?" To this he said very loud for him, "Would you?" And for the first time he lifted his head to look at me with wonder and incredulity. He lifted his head so sharply that there could be no mistake. I had touched a spring. I saw the whole extent of my opportunity and could hardly believe in it. "Why, speak to... well, of course," I proceeded very slowly, watching him with great attention, for on my word I feared a joke. "Not perhaps to the young lady herself. I can't speak German, you know, but..." He interrupted me with the earnest assurance that Hermann had the highest opinion of me, and at once I felt the need for the greatest possible diplomacy at this juncture, so I demurred just enough to draw him on. Falk sat up, but except for a very noticeable enlargement of the pupils, till the irises of his eyes were reduced to 2 narrow yellow rings, his face, I should judge, was incapable of expressing excitement. Oh, yes, Hermann did have the greatest. "Take up your cards. Here's Schomberg peeping at us through the blind," I said. We went through the motions of what might have been a game of écarté. Presently the intolerable scandal-monger withdrew, probably to inform the people in the billiard-room that we two were gambling on the veranda like mad. We were not gambling, but it was a game in which I felt I held the winning cards. The stake, roughly speaking, was the success of the voyage, for me, and he, I apprehended, had nothing to lose. Our intimacy matured rapidly, and before many words had been exchanged, I perceived that the excellent Hermann had been making use of me. That simple and astute Teuton had been, it seems, holding me up to Falk in the light of a rival. I was young enough to be shocked at so much duplicity. "Did he tell you that in so many words?" I asked with indignation. Hermann had not. He had given hints only, and of course it had not taken very much to alarm Falk. But instead of declaring himself, he had taken steps to remove the family from under my influence. He was perfectly straightforward about it, as straightforward as a tile falling on your head. There was no duplicity in that man, and when I congratulated him on the perfection of his arrangements, even to the bribing of the wretched Johnson against me, he had a genuine moment of protest. Never bribed! He knew the man wouldn't work as long as he had a few cents in his pocket to get drunk on, and naturally, he said, naturally, he let him have $1 or $2. He was himself a sailor, he said, and anticipated the view another sailor, like myself, was bound to take. On the other hand, he was sure that I should have to come to grief. He hadn't been knocking about for the last 7 years up and down that river for nothing. It would have been no disgrace to me, but he asserted confidently I would have had my ship very awkwardly ashore at a spot 2 miles below the great pagoda. And with all that, he had no ill will. That was evident. This was a crisis in which his only object had been to gain time, I fancy. And presently he mentioned that he had written for some jewelry. Real, good jewelry. Had written to Hong Kong for it. It would arrive in a day or 2. Well, then, I said cheerily, everything is all right. All you've got to do is to present it to the lady together with your heart and live happy ever after. Upon the whole, he seemed to accept that view as far as the girl was concerned, but the eyelids drooped. There was still something in the way. For one thing, Hermann disliked him so much. As to me, on the contrary, it seemed as though he could not praise me enough. Mrs. Hermann, too. He didn't know why they disliked him so. It made everything most difficult. I listened, impassive, feeling more and more diplomatic. His speech was not transparently clear. He was one of those men who seem to live, feel, suffer in a sort of mental twilight. But as to being fascinated by the girl and possessed by the desire of home life with her, it was as clear as daylight. So much being at stake, he was afraid of putting it to the hazard of the declaration. Besides, there was something else, and with Hermann being so set against him. I see, I said thoughtfully, while my heart beat fast with the excitement of my diplomacy. I don't mind sounding Hermann. In fact, to show you how mistaken you were, I am ready to do all I can for you in that way. A light sigh escaped him. He drew his hands down his face, and it emerged bony, unchanged of expression, as if all the tissues had been ossified. All the passion was in those big brown hands. He was satisfied. Then there was that other matter. If there were anybody on earth, it was I who could persuade Hermann to take a reasonable view. I had a knowledge of the world and lots of experience. Hermann admitted this himself. And then I was a sailor, too. Falk thought that a sailor would be able to understand certain things best. He talked as if the Hermanns had been living all their life in a rural hamlet, and I alone had been capable, with my practice in life, of a large and indulgent view of certain occurrences. That was what my diplomacy was leading me to. I began suddenly to dislike it. I say, Falk, I asked quite brusquely, you haven't already a wife put away somewhere? The pain and disgust of his denial were very striking. Couldn't I understand that he was as respectable as any white man hereabouts, earning his living honestly? He was suffering from my suspicion, and the low undertone of his voice made his protestations sound very pathetic. For a moment he shamed me, but my diplomacy notwithstanding, I seemed to develop a conscience, as if in very truth it were in my power to decide the success of this matrimonial enterprise. By pretending hard enough, we come to believe anything to our advantage. And I had been pretending very hard, because I meant yet to be towed safely down the river. But through conscience or stupidity I couldn't help alluding to the Vanlo affair. "You acted rather badly there, didn't you?" was what I ventured actually to say, for the logic of our conduct is always at the mercy of obscure and unforeseen impulses. His dilated pupils swerved from my face, glancing at the window with a sort of scared fury. We heard behind the blinds the continuous and sudden clicking of ivory, a jovial murmur of many voices, and Schomberg's deep, manly laugh. "That confounded old woman of a hotel keeper that would never let it rest," Falk exclaimed. Well, yes, it had happened 2 years ago. When it came to the point, he owned he couldn't make up his mind to trust Fred Vanlo, no sailor, a bit of a fool, too. He could not trust him. But to stop his row, he had lent him enough money to pay all his debts before he left. I was greatly surprised to hear this. Then Falk could not be such a miser after all. So much the better for the gal. For a time he sat silent. Then he picked up a card, and while looking at it he said, "You need not think of anything bad. It was an accident. I've been unfortunate once." "Then in heaven's name say nothing about it." As soon as these words were out of my mouth, I fancied I had said something immoral. He shook his head negatively. It had to be told. He considered it proper that the relations of the lady should know. No doubt, I thought to myself, had Miss Vanlo not been 30 and damaged by the climate, he would have found it possible to entrust Fred Vanlo with this confidence. And then the figure of Hermann's niece appeared before my mind's eye, with the wealth of her opulent form, her rich youth, her lavish strength. With that powerful and immaculate vitality, her girlish form must have shouted aloud of life to that man, whereas poor Miss Vanlo could only sing sentimental songs to the strumming of a piano. "And that Hermann hates me, I know it," he cried in his undertone, with a sudden recrudescence of anxiety. "I must tell them. It is proper that they should know. You would say so yourself." He then murmured an utterly mysterious allusion to the necessity for peculiar domestic arrangements. Though my curiosity was excited, I did not want to hear any of his confidences. I feared he might give me a piece of information that would make my assumed role of matchmaker odious, however unreal it was. I was aware that he could have the girl for the asking, and keeping down a desire to laugh in his face, I expressed a confident belief in my ability to argue away Hermann's dislike for him. "I am sure I can make it all right," I said. He looked very pleased. And when we rose, not a word had been said about towage, not a word. The game was won, and the honor was safe. Oh, blessed white cotton umbrella! We shook hands, and I was holding myself with difficulty from breaking into a dance of joy when he came back, striding all the length of the veranda, and said doubtfully, "I say, Captain, I have your word. You won't turn round?" Heavens! The fright he gave me! Behind his tone of doubt there was something desperate and menacing. The infatuated ass! But I was equal to the situation. "My dear Falk," I said, beginning to lie with a glibness and effrontery that amazed me even at the time, "confidence for confidence." He had made no confidences. "I will tell you that I am already engaged to an extremely charming girl at home, and so you understand." He caught my hand and wrung it in a crushing grip. "Pardon me. I feel it every day more difficult to live alone." "On rice and fish," I interrupted smartly. giggling with the sheer nervousness of escaped danger. He dropped my hand as if it had become suddenly red hot. A moment of profound silence ensued, as though something extraordinary had happened. "I promise you to obtain Hermann's consent," I faltered out at last, and it seemed to me that he could not help seeing through that humbugging promise. "If there's anything else to get over, I shall endeavor to stand by you," I conceded further, feeling somehow defeated and overborne. "But you must do your best yourself." "I have been unfortunate once," he muttered unemotionally, and turning his back on me, he went away, thumping slowly the plank floor as if his feet had been shod with iron. Next morning, however, he was lively enough as man-boat, a combination of splashing and shouting, of the insolent commotion below with the steady, overbearing glare of the silent headpiece above. He turned us out most unnecessarily at an ungodly hour, but it was nearly 11 in the morning before he brought me up a cable's length from Hermann's ship, and he did it very badly, too, in a hurry, and nearly contriving to miss altogether the patch of good holding ground, because, forsooth, he had caught sight of Hermann's niece on the poop. And so did I, and probably as soon as he had seen her himself. I saw the modest, sleek glory of the tawny head, and the full grey shape of the girlish print frock she filled so perfectly, so satisfactorily, with the seduction of unfaltering curves, a very nymph of Diana the huntress, and Diana the ship sat high-walled and as solid as an institution on the smooth level of the water, the most uninspiring and respectable craft upon the seas, useful and ugly, devoted to the support of domestic virtues like any grocer's shop on shore. At once Falk steamed away, for there was some work for him to do. He would return in the evening. He ranged close by us, passing out dead slow without a hail, the beat of the paddle wheels reverberating amongst the stony islets, as if from the ruined walls of a vast arena, filled the anchorage confusedly with the clapping sounds as of a mighty and leisurely applause. Abreast of Hermann's ship, Falk stopped the engines, and a profound silence reigned over the rocks, the shore, and the sea, for the time it took him to raise his hat aloft before the nymph of the grey print frock. I had snatched up my binoculars, and I can answer for it, she didn't stir a limb. Standing by the rail, shapely and erect, with one of her hands grasping a rope at the height of her head, while the way of the tug carried slowly past her the lingering and profound homage of the man. There was for me an enormous significance in the scene, the sense of having witnessed a solemn declaration. The die was cast. After such a manifestation he couldn't back out, and I reflected that it was nothing whatever to me now, with a rush of black smoke belching suddenly out of the funnel, and a mad swirl of paddle wheels provoking a burst of weird and precipitated clapping, the tug shot out of the desolate arena. The rocky islets lay on the sea like the heaps of a cyclopean ruin on a plain. The centipedes and scorpions lurked under the stones. There was not a single blade of grass in sight anywhere, not a single lizard sunning himself on a boulder by the shore. When I looked again at Hermann's ship, the girl had disappeared. I could not detect the smallest dot of a bird on the immense sky, and the flatness of the land continued the flatness of the sea to the naked line of the horizon. This is the setting now inseparably connected with my knowledge of Falk's misfortune. My diplomacy had brought me there, and now I had only to wait the time for taking up the role of an ambassador. My diplomacy was a success. My ship was safe. Old Gambrill would probably live. A feeble sound of a tapping hammer came intermittently from the Diana. During the afternoon I looked at times at the old homely ship, the faithful nurse of Hermann's progeny, or yawned towards the distant temple of Buddha, like a lonely hillock on the plain, where shaven priests cherish the thoughts of that annihilation which is the worthy reward of us all. Unfortunate! He had been unfortunate once. Well, that was not so bad as life goes. And what the devil could be the nature of that misfortune? I remembered that I had known a man before who had declared himself to have fallen years ago a victim to misfortune, but this misfortune, whose effects appeared permanent, he looked desperately hard up, when considered dispassionately, seemed indistinguishable from a breach of trust. Could it be something of that nature? Apart, however, from the utter improbability that he would offer to talk of it even to his future uncle-in-law, I had a strange feeling that Falk's physique unfitted him for that sort of delinquency. As the person of Hermann's niece exhaled the profound physical charm of feminine form, so her adorer's big frame embodied to my senses the hard, straight masculinity that would conceivably kill but would not condescend to cheat. The thing was obvious. I might just as well have suspected the girl of a curvature of the spine, and I perceived that the sun was about to set. The smoke of Falk's tug hove in sight, far away at the mouth of the river. It was time for me to assume the character of an ambassador, and the negotiation would not be difficult except in the matter of keeping my countenance. It was all too extravagantly nonsensical, and I conceived that it would be best to compose for myself a grave demeanor. I practiced this in my boat as I went along, but the bashfulness that came secretly upon me the moment I stepped on the deck of the Diana is inexplicable. As soon as we had exchanged greetings, Hermann asked me eagerly if I knew whether Falk had found his white parasol. "He's going to bring it to you himself directly," I said with great solemnity. "Meantime, I am charged with an important message for which he begs your favorable consideration. He is in love with your niece." "Ach, so!" he hissed with an animosity that made my assumed gravity change into the most genuine concern. What meant this tone? And I hurried on. "He wishes, with your consent, of course, to ask her to marry him at once, before you leave here, that is. He would speak to his consul." Hermann sat down and smoked violently. 5 minutes passed in that furious meditation, and then, taking the long pipe out of his mouth, he burst into a hot diatribe against Falk, against his cupidity, his stupidity, a fellow that can hardly be got to say yes or no to the simplest question, against his outrageous treatment of the shipping in port, because he saw they were at his mercy, and against his manner of walking, which to his Hermann's mind showed a conceit positively unbearable. The damage to the old Diana was not forgotten, of course, and there was nothing of any nature said or done by Falk, even to the last offer of refreshment in the hotel, that did not seem to have been a cause of offense. Had the cheek to drag him, Hermann, into that coffee-room, as though a drink from him could make up for $47.50 of damage in the cost of wood alone, not counting 2 days' work for the carpenter. Of course he would not stand in the girl's way. He was going home to Germany. There were plenty of poor girls walking about in Germany. "He's very much in love," was all I found to say. "Yes," he cried, "and it is time, too, after making himself and me talked about ashore the last voyage I was here, and then now again coming on board every evening, unsettling the girl's mind, and saying nothing? What sort of conduct is that?" The $7,000 the fellow was always talking about did not, in his opinion, justify such behavior. Moreover, nobody had seen them. He, Hermann, seriously doubted if Falk possessed 7,000 cents, and the tug, no doubt, was mortgaged up to the firm of Ziegers. But let that pass. He wouldn't stand in the girl's way. Her head was so turned that she had become no good to them of late, quite unable even to put the children to bed without her aunt. It was bad for the children. They got unruly, and yesterday he actually had to give Gustav a thrashing. For that, too, Falk was made responsible, apparently, and looking at my Hermann's heavy, puffy, good-natured face, I knew he would not exert himself till greatly exasperated, and therefore would thrash very hard, and being fat would resent the necessity. How Falk had managed to turn the girl's head was more difficult to understand. I supposed Hermann would know. And then, hadn't there been Miss Vanlo? It could not be his silvery tongue or the subtle seduction of his manner. He had no more of what is called manner than an animal, which, however, on the other hand, is never and can never be called vulgar. Therefore it must have been his bodily appearance, exhibiting a virility of nature as exaggerated as his beard, and resembling a sort of constant ruthlessness. It was seen in the very manner he lolled in the chair. He meant no offense, but his intercourse was characterized by that sort of frank disregard of susceptibilities a tall man, living in a world of dwarfs, would naturally assume, without in the least wishing to be unkind. But amongst men of his own stature, or nearly, this frank use of his advantages, in such matters as the awful towage bills, for instance, caused much impotent gnashing of teeth. When attentively considered, it seemed appalling at times. He was a strange beast, but maybe women liked it. Seen in that light, he was well worth taming, and I suppose every woman at the bottom of her heart considers herself as a tamer of strange beasts. But Hermann arose with precipitation to carry the news to his wife. I had barely the time, as he made for the cabin door, to grab him by the seat of his inexpressibles. I begged him to wait till Falk in person had spoken with him. There remained some small matter to talk over, as I understood. He sat down again at once, full of suspicion. "What matter?" he said surlily. "I have had enough of his nonsense. There's no matter at all, as he knows very well. The girl has nothing in the world. She came to us in one thin dress when my brother died, and I have a growing family." "It can't be anything of that kind," I opined. "He's desperately enamored of your niece. I don't know why he did not say so before. Upon my word, I believe it is because he was afraid to lose, perhaps, the felicity of sitting near her on your quarter-deck." I intimated my conviction that Falk's love was so great as to be, in a sense, cowardly. The effects of a great passion are unaccountable. It has been known to make a man timid, but Hermann looked at me as if I had raved, and the twilight was dying out rapidly. "You don't believe in passion, do you, Hermann?" I continued cheerily. "The passion of fear will make a cornered rat courageous. Falk's in a corner. He will take her off your hands in one thin frock, just as she came to you. And after 10 years' service, it isn't a bad bargain," I added. Far from taking offense, he resumed his air of civic virtue. The sudden night came upon him while he stared placidly along the deck, bringing in contact with his thick lips, and taking away again, after a jet of smoke, the curved mouthpiece fitted to the stem of his pipe. The night came upon him and buried in haste his whiskers, his globular eyes, his puffy, pale face, his fat knees, and the vast, flat slippers on his fatherly feet. Only his short arms in respectable white shirt-sleeves remained very visible, propped up like the flippers of seal reposing on the strand. "Falk wouldn't settle anything about repairs. Told me to find out first how much wood I should require, and he would see," he remarked. And after he had spat peacefully in the dusk, we heard over the water the beat of the tug's floats. There is, on a calm night, nothing more suggestive of fierce and headlong haste than the rapid sound made by the paddle wheels of a boat threshing her way through a quiet sea. And the approach of Falk towards his fate seemed to be urged by an impatient and passionate desire. The engines must have been driven to the very utmost of their revolutions. We heard them slow down at last, and vaguely the white hull of the tug appeared moving against the black islets, whilst a slow and rhythmical clapping as of thousands of hands rose on all sides. It ceased all at once, just before Falk brought her up. A single brusque splash was followed by the long-drawn rumbling of iron links running through the hawse-pipe. Then a solemn silence fell upon the roadstead. "He will soon be here," I murmured, and after that we waited for him without a word. Meantime, raising my eyes, I beheld the glitter of a lofty sky above the Diana's mastheads. The multitude of stars gathered into clusters, in rows, in lines, in masses, in groups, shone all together, unanimously, and the few isolated ones, blazing by themselves in the midst of dark patches, seemed to be of a superior kind and of an inextinguishable nature. But long striding footsteps were heard hastening along the deck. The high bulwarks of the Diana made a deeper darkness. We rose from our chairs quickly, and Falk, appearing before us, all in white, stood still. Nobody spoke at first, as though we had been covered with confusion. His arrival was fiery, but his white bulk, of indefinite shape and without features, made him loom up like a man of snow. "The captain here has been telling me," Hermann began in a homely and amicable voice, and Falk gave a low, nervous laugh,